Hello, everybody, and welcome to Kilroy Was Here, a series of reviews focused on movies about or set in the time of World War II. Our goal? To dig a little bit deeper and not just give you a review of the movie, but also give you a sense of what the movie meant in the time that it was made and how that movie's time shapes our perception today about the events of this great conflict. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Kilroy Was Here, the movie review series that takes us through the movies about World War II from various periods in our history, commenting on what they meant to the audiences who saw them for the first time, what they were trying to tell us about the history as it actually occurred, and what those movies have to teach us today. I'm Matt Bromond, I'm your host, and today we're going to take on a particularly important part of World War II's history, at least from the American standpoint. You see, before World War II, the United States had always had a very race-segregated mindset about what the different component parts of our American society could do. We had very, very limited roles that we allowed Black Americans to participate in. And it's not like World War II ended that. It's more that World War II, by putting the nation's ideals front and center in the war to battle and defeat Nazism and Japanese imperialism, caused America to begin to seriously engage with its own very, very conflicted racial history of animus and prejudice. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to take on one of the two major movies released in the last few years about the Tuskegee Airmen. Now, I say two because it's an interesting subject. The Tuskegee Airmen were one of the most successful groups of fighter pilots in American military history. And yet, despite their success, they were considered an experiment when they were first created. They were reviled and rejected by a number of very racist political entities in the United States. And Hollywood has held off on really addressing what they did and what they contributed until the latter part of the 20th century. The first movie, which is the better one, the one we're going to spend more time talking about, is The Tuskegee Airmen, put out by HBO in 1995. The second is Redtails, put out by Lucasfilm much later on. And the reason why it's not going to be our focus is because, candidly, it's just not a very good movie. It has some of the same actors, it deals with some of the same history, and it has much better budgeting and resourcing. And yet, somehow, as a result of all of that, they ended up not putting as much effort into the story and the heart, and they ended up with a weaker movie. So we're not going to talk much about that. We're going to talk about the Tuskegee Airmen movie. Now, this movie came out 3 years before Saving Private Ryan, and thematically and tonally, it has a whole lot in common with Saving Private Ryan. The biggest difference between the Tuskegee Airmen and Saving Private Ryan is budget. Steven Spielberg had a whole lot more money and he deployed it in Saving Private Ryan. We've reviewed that in an earlier episode of Kilroy Was Here, and I would encourage you to watch that and share your comments and thoughts on it. But the Tuskegee Airmen movie was put together by HBO, and it was put together by HBO in essence as a passion project to bring the story of the Tuskegee Airmen to a broader audience. The United States, by the late 1990s, had really come to accept the fact that in order for general American audiences to understand just how significant Black Americans' contributions had been to the overall nation's history, that there were going to have to be special efforts put into telling their stories. The simple truth is, Black people were not featured prominently in movies about World War II for decades. They were practically invisible in the movies that were made in the 40s. They were practically invisible in the movies made in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. If you recall, in Patton, there's one meaningful Black character, and unfortunately, his role is tiny and his input is so small. He's essentially there as an aide to General Patton, and he's there to show the godlike respect his soldiers had for him. Similarly, in one of the earliest movies we reviewed, Casablanca, there is a major black character, but Sam's a piano player and he's a best friend character for Rick. He's not the focal point. He's not really engaging with the racial prejudice of the era. He's not really facing the challenges of war. He's there to bring Rick along and to serve as an emotional gateway into Rick's conflict and his heart. The Tuskegee Airmen is a very different movie, and it's a very different movie consciously. Now, the movie begins, and it lets you know as soon as it gets started that this is a movie deeply seated in the experiences of World War II. It begins with Lawrence Fishburne's character, a fictional composite, as all the characters in this movie are. The only legitimate historical presence in the movie is Benjamin O. Davis, a true American hero, one of the first black men to graduate from West Point, certainly one of the first black men to wear a general's stars, and an American hero who truly fought for the right of all people to defend this nation. Benjamin O. Davis is a real person, and Benjamin O. Davis is played by Andre Braugher in the movie, and he's played very well by Andre Braugher in the movie. All the rest of the characters are fictionalized composites of real people. So the movie begins in December of 1942. The United States have been at war for a year. The manpower needs and the mobilization are now very clear to the United States. And it begins with a fireside chat by FDR, who's making clear that this war is not just a war over arms and territories, but rather a war for ideas and ideals. And in that way, the movie wants you to know from the outset that the project of the Tuskegee Airmen is not just to defeat Nazis in the air, but also to defeat prejudice on the ground. Lawrence Fishburne, his character is a well-educated young man in Iowa. He has the support of his community in his work to go off and join the Tuskegee Airmen and learn how to fly fighter planes. It's been his dream since he was a boy to learn to fly planes. The movie sets a high-minded, emotional, idealistic tone early on by Fishburne's character. He's not ambivalent about fighting. He's not ambivalent about serving his country. He's not ambivalent about confronting the prejudice that he's sure to face. He's determined to show that he can make a difference. And in that sense, it's very similar to Saving Private Ryan, which also elevated the idea of national sacrifice being something that this generation took on voluntarily. If you are a fan of the Greatest Generation narrative, which says that the young adults who survived the Depression and fought World War II represent the greatest and the best of American ideals, then the Tuskegee Airmen is going to be a good fit for you and your aspirations. The cast is top to bottom outstanding. HBO may not have needed to spend a whole lot of money to get everybody to step in on a project this positive and this socially affirming, but they definitely did not scrimp on getting the best actors they could for these roles. Cuba Gooding Jr. plays in a really exceptional way in this movie. Andre Braugher is, as always, tremendously effective, and Lawrence Fishburne is the emotional heart and soul of the movie. He carries the audience through the experiences without difficulty. So, when the movie was made, what's the history it depicts? Starting in 1942, the United States realized they needed to have a lot more combat-trained pilots, especially fighter pilots, to protect the strategic bombing mission that they had decided they were going to embark upon as a way of breaking Germany. So as part of that, there were all of these pilot camps set up all over the country, and FDR's New Deal allies said this is an important thing for us to do, to have black pilots in the air as fighter pilots to prove that there is, in fact, no place in the military for racial prejudice. Of course, this was opposed, especially in the South, which put a curious tension on the whole experience because most of the historically black colleges in the United States were also in the South. So the places that were best suited to training pilots, who were all going to be college graduates, who all needed to be officers, who all needed to have a very high degree of technical understanding, because you don't just get in a plane and put on the throttle. You have to understand thrust and drag and angles of attack and so many complicated mathematical concepts that the selection process to be a Tuskegee Airman would basically ensure that you were getting the best, the brightest, the most well educated, the most intelligent young people you could find to do this incredibly dangerous work. That meant that to bring them all together at a university or a college campus where they would feel comfortable, where they would feel safe, you were looking at historically black colleges. You also needed areas where you had a lot of flat and available land to put airstrips on. That also pointed you towards the south or the southwest and away from the urban cores in the northeast. As a result, Tuskegee, Alabama ended up being the center point for this whole project. A series of airstrips were built all around Alabama, and what that meant was all of the best and the brightest of young black America got on trains and left wherever they were from to come into the deepest, darkest part of the segregated South. And the movie doesn't hesitate to show you that. At one point during the train ride early on in the movie, when they cross out of the north and into the south, the porters come through and require all of the black pilots, these young men who have volunteered to defend our country and fight Nazism, to get up and get into the back of the train where the accommodations are much worse. Why? Because they're black, and that's the rule in Alabama. And unfortunately, what that also meant was not only did they have to suffer prejudice, but they had to give up their seats in favor of German prisoners of war, people who had actually carried arms to fight against Americans were given better accommodations than black Americans who were volunteering to defend our country. It's a moment that really hits an audience in 1990, and I know the directors put it in there in order to make clear that we have come a long way, but man, did we have a long way to go when this all took place. The pilots don't just experience racism in the community, they also experience it in the Army. They have a variety of officers, some of whom are pro the process of integrating the military and pro the process of allowing black Americans to defend this country as fighter pilots, and others who are rooted in the racial prejudices of the day in their community. Ultimately, over the course of a long training sequence, some pilots die, some pilots succeed, some pilots break under the pressure and quit. But what's made really clear by the performances is that the commitment to excellence and success on the part of the Tuskegee Airmen win over the prejudice among the officers training them and end up producing a cohesive and determined and even elite military unit that's committed to succeeding. In this part, there's a particularly powerful fictionalized character played by Courtney B. Vance. He's a great actor, and he does a great job in this movie as well. He plays a pilot who volunteered to fight with the British in the Battle of Britain before America would allow American blacks to fly, fought against the Nazis in the Battle of Britain, engaged in combat, and then serves as the combat instructor for the Tuskegee Airmen. In this role, he is possessed of such immense gravitas and dignity and strength that it's truly inspiring to watch a portrayal of a character who has that kind of self-possession and commitment to being a good mentor. His work across the board is outstanding. I've enjoyed him in almost every movie I've seen him in, and the Tuskegee Airmen is no exception. When they actually get into combat, it's early 1943, and for this part it's pretty historically accurate. The Tuskegee Airmen were first deployed with American troops in North Africa. That was the first arena of combat where the Americans came into direct combat with the Germans. The Tuskegee Airmen were given outdated planes, were given low priority missions, and then were castigated for not having more success in air-to-air combat against the Germans. Ultimately, Benjamin O. Davis, B.O.D., as he's known in historical recollections because of his oversized influence on this course of events, B.O.D. ended up testifying in Washington and demonstrating that the chance given the Tuskegee Airmen was not fair, was not adequate, was not sufficient, and he won for them better planes, Mustangs, won for them better assignments, and once he got them those better assignments, the results were truly remarkable. The movie ends by showing you how the Tuskegee Airmen earned their distinctive nickname of the Redtails. Their P-51 Mustangs were painted with a bright red tail so that that fighter group could be recognized. This part of the movie makes it seem as if that's a unique thing to the Tuskegee Airmen alone. It's not really true. Most fighter groups, and certainly most American planes during World War II, used distinctive markings to note squadron group connection. The Redtails impact is particularly striking because it's visually distinct at a great distance, and because of how they flew and how they fought, they earned a particular amount of esteem for being Redtails. Quick side note, one of the issues that came up in our society in the early part of the 2020s was what to rename the Washington football team. As you may or may not know, they had been called the Washington Redskins for decades, and that name was considered to be pretty much a racial slur. So eventually they dropped it, and they went by the extremely bland Washington Football Club for a number of years before settling on the almost as bland Washington Commanders. But I and a number of other folks were lobbying hard for them to go with Redtails, because the Redtails of the Tuskegee Airmen are a particularly significant historical truth and a true symbol that would resonate, I think, with Washington in particular. Plus, it has the right numbers of syllables and sounds to allow the football fans to use the exact same song that they used for their football team. But instead, they went with the Commanders, and so now we're all stuck with the incredibly dull Washington Commanders instead of what I think would have been a lot of fun, the Washington Redtails. The movie ends, the Tuskegee Airmen movie ends with Lawrence Fishburne realizing, as he completes another successful mission defending the bombers that are attacking Germany itself. The war has moved into its final phase. American strategic bombers flying from Italy are attacking into Germany itself. It ends with a montage showing that he's the last one of their group of initial trainees to survive. And that's a particularly important notion that's very common in movies of the late 90s about World War II, is to have the audience point of view character, in this case Lawrence Fishburne's character, Captain Lee, think back on all those who died getting to the moment of victory. I think this is an important touch point for movies about World War II made in the late 90s, because they're trying to convey to an audience that the World War II generation of the surviving veterans of World War II by the 1990s were reaching the age where they're going to start dying in large numbers. They were starting to reach their 70s. And so almost all of these movies, Saving Private Ryan and Tuskegee Airmen being the two examples we've reviewed, both emphasize this survivor carrying with them the sacrifices of all those who they trained with. And I think the notion is to artistically convey to you and the audience that you similarly are the heir to these brave veterans and their sacrifices. That's the intention of the movie. That's an intention that Saving Private Ryan later duplicated on a theatrical screen, and the Tuskegee Airmen conveyed initially on HBO screens at home. Now, how accurate is the history? It's fictionalized. All of the characters are agglomerations of real people, but it's pretty accurate. The budget limits cause them to not use the right kinds of planes for all of the training, although they do use biplanes for the training at Tuskegee, and that's a big, long focus of the movie, and I think that's great. They do have the most remarkable historical moment, which is Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady of the United States, decided that one of the ways to shut up the racists would be for her to trust her own life to one of these black pilots. So when she went to do an inspection of the airfield, and she did it on purpose, she chose to do this, nobody made her do it, she then insisted on going up in the air with one of the cadet pilots, not one of the white instructors, but rather one of the black cadet pilots. This got a lot of press, got a lot of attention. There are photographs of it, and it's one of the moments when you know that Eleanor Roosevelt didn't just talk the talk, she was willing to walk the walk. She had no doubt that racial equality was a biological reality and needed to be a social and legal reality, even when that made other New Dealers uncomfortable. The second thing that's pretty historically accurate is it shows the Tuskegee Airmen engaging in an attack on a German destroyer. They did, in fact, destroy a destroyer, a warship, with the bullets, the cannon shots from a fighter plane, which is pretty outstanding. They did that in Italy. And then lastly, they do point out that the bomber pilots that they defended, because they flew Mustangs in a bomber escort role, the bomber pilots, while initially having, similar to most Americans, conflicted responses to black Americans being fighter pilots. Some thought they couldn't do the job, some thought they could do the job. It was an ambivalent experience as a whole. The bomber pilots, after realizing how the Tuskegee Airmen fought ferociously and tenaciously to defend them, requested that the Tuskegee Airmen fighter group, the 332nd, be the one assigned to defend them on their first missions into Germany. And they defended a number of missions into Germany where they achieved a remarkably high success rate. The myth is that not a single strategic bomber was lost to enemy fire when guarded by one of the Tuskegee Airmen squadrons. That's not true. They lost about 5. But considering that they had been losing a third of all the bombers that they sent up, and they cut that down to almost none, it's undeniable that the Tuskegee Airmen made a huge impact on the survival of the bomber crews that they escorted. So those 3 historical parts are all very solid. Benjamin O. Davis, his portrayal is also very historically accurate. So that's the good of the history, and it captures a very important moment that lasted the 3 years from when its inception in 1942 to the end of the war in 1945. What does it mean for us now? Well, when you watch it in 2023, what's really remarkable, seeing Saving Private Ryan and the Tuskegee Airmen, is how much more racially conflicted our society seems to be now than it was in the late 90s. In the late 90s, there's no real tonal difference between how Spielberg portrays The Greatest Generation in Saving Private Ryan and how HBO shows the Tuskegee Airmen and the Tuskegee Airmen. Now, they add the element in the Tuskegee Airmen that the pilots had to overcome racism, but they don't treat it as if it's somehow different in quality than the sacrifices made by every other veteran in World War II to defend the United States. It's treated as we were one nation and we had one additional difficulty for black airmen to achieve their ability to contribute meaningfully to the defense of the nation. Now in 2023, I suspect the movies would be much more focused on the racism as opposed to the common shared patriotic sacrifice to defeat the Nazis. And part of the reason I think that is the movie we talked about at the very beginning, Redtails. Same subject, just made about 10, 15 years later. In that movie, the racism is made much more of a center point of the portrayal, to the point even where in Redtails, they invent a German fighter ace who makes it his particular Nazified racist mission to take down as many Tuskegee Airmen as he can. In Redtails, the racism is the enemy. In the Tuskegee Airmen, it's the process of developing the competency of being a fighter pilot, the process of learning how to overcome war and its loss of friends and people you've bonded with, while also demonstrating effectively against racism. It's a subtle distinction, but because it's one that we've lived from the 90s through the 2020s, I think it's particularly important to think about. So, in summary, the Tuskegee Airmen, what is it? It's a great movie to make you feel inspired about how individuals in our nation can make our nation's ideals more real. It's also a great moral lesson that the work of improving our society is never really done, and it's never really for someone else to do. It's for you to do in your individual life and in your collective actions. This is particularly illustrated in the movie through a couple of the racist officers, the bomber crew and one of the instructor, who over the course of the movie realize that their prejudice is actually interfering with their ability to succeed and win the war, and that it's important to overcome that. And lastly, it's a good movie to remind us of the importance of individuals maintaining their dignity and their integrity in the face of hostility and opposition. Benjamin O. Davis, I've mentioned him a number of times throughout this. He's a real person. He's a real hero. And the way Andre Braugher plays him is to say that under no circumstances is he going to allow racism to make him into something other than what he is, a competent, professional pilot, officer, and leader. That example is one that's particularly inspiring, and I would think it would resonate with young people and adults equally. So, if you are ready to get into a movie about an important historical phase of World War II, and one that will challenge your stereotypical notions about how America was racist and responded to racism in its actions, the Tuskegee Airmen is a great one. You're going to see a lot of great actors performing very, very well, and you're going to see a movie with a lot of heart. And at the end of it, you will absolutely feel like this is akin to Saving Private Ryan in terms of tone and point and the overall emphasis on honoring what the Greatest Generation did for us. Here at Kilroy Was Here, we have had a blast bringing you the first few movies. I know there's been an interruption between issues, but that's mostly because I personally wanted to make sure that I had my mind focused on the right issues. The Tuskegee Airmen and Redtails was a particularly challenging thing to approach because in 2023 we act like the things that divide us are so very significant that they ought to silence us even talking about them. And what I've realized is that silence is in fact compliance with the notion. And I don't agree with the notion. We are an American nation. We are a people with a history together. And that history is best understood when shared and talked about. I personally believe that the efforts of the patriots who volunteered to fight in World War II saved our country, changed our country, and everything that happened in what is called the civil rights era of the late 50s and 60s was made truly possible and brought to life during World War II by patriots like Benjamin O. Davis, the rest of the Tuskegee Airmen, Eleanor Roosevelt, who said, this moment of crisis, this moment of real challenge is one we're going to meet with all of our people. And we're not going to hold back because we have these prejudices and these beliefs, these stereotypical beliefs that have somehow persisted. So, the Tuskegee Airmen, I would encourage it to you, and I look forward to seeing you at our next episode of Kilroy Was Here. Thank you. Kilroy Was Here is a product of the Evocati Legal Services Foundation, Matt Broman, President. This project, and every other project of the Evocati Legal Services Foundation, is done to bring awareness and support to veterans and active duty service members. If you want to be a part of our project, please join us over at www.evocati.org.in. We are committed to serving those who have served us all.